show you how to stack and frost a cake like a pro. So if you want to build the perfect layer cake, you need to start with even layers that are slightly chilled or even cold. If you baked your cake layers ahead of time, just make sure that you wrap them up in plastic wrap really tight and store them in the fridge. If you're going to bake your cake and stack the layers on the same day, bake your cake layers, then wrap them up in plastic and then just chill them for an hour or two until they cool down. And keeping your cake layers chilled is just gonna make it a lot easier to stack the layers without anything sliding around or having your cake lean over to one side or the other. And I do have another video with 5 tips for how to bake up perfectly even cake layers, so if you haven't seen that one, go ahead and check that out first. Now, if your cakes have domes on top or if the tops are uneven, you're gonna wanna trim that off and get nice, even, flat top layers before you start stacking your cake. And make sure that you wait until the last minute to trim your cakes. You want them to be completely cool and you don't wanna trim them ahead of time because that might cause your cakes to dry out and that's no good. There are a few different ways you can trim your cakes. I would recommend using either a long serrated knife or a cake leveler. So if you have a cake leveler, there should be these little notches on the side and then you can kind of just squeeze it together and move the wire up and down to adjust to the height of your cake. So you just want to line up the wire of the cake leveler as high as you can go on the cake before it starts doming. And usually you can see a line where the cake was touching the sides of the pan, and that's about where you want to be. To use the cake leveler, make sure you're working on a nice clear flat surface and then put the feet firmly onto the counter and use a sawing back and forth motion to push the leveler through the cake. If your cake happens to have a thicker crust, you might find the leveler starts to sort of tear pieces out instead of cutting a nice clean line. If that's happening to you, it can help to rotate the cake as you cut rather than cutting straight from one side to the other. And then you also might want to hold the cake up against your opposite hand, and that's going to support the edge as you cut so that you're not putting all the pressure on that crust. Some of it is going into your hand. If you want to use a knife instead, you can actually cut the cake on the counter or on your turntable. And the first thing that you want to do is just score a line all around the cake. You only want to cut in about an inch or so. Again, find that line where the cake started to pull away from the side of the pan, and that's where you want to cut. So you're going to score all the way around the cake first, and then you're going to use that first cut as your guideline to keep the knife level as you cut through the entire cake. After you go around once, start to cut another inch or so deeper, but keep your eye on that original score line and make sure that both ends of the knife are staying in that line. Keep rotating the cake and just cutting a little bit more and more until you reach the middle. And if your original line was level, the whole cut should be even and level. All right, so now that you've got your cake layers trimmed and they're nice and even and they're all chilled and ready to go, you're gonna wanna get out your cake board and your turntable. So I like to use these just white cardboard circles, but you can get decorative ones and they come in all different sizes. And you kind of have 2 options for size. You can either get a cake board that's the exact same size as your cake so that you won't see it sticking out from the edges of your cake, but you'll still be able to slide a spatula under and lift your cake. Or you can also get one that's just a little bit wider than your cake, and that'll make it really easy to lift up and transfer. If you get a decorative cake board, it looks really nice even if it's sticking out from the cake, so I know a lot of people like to do it that way. So now you can go ahead and put your cake board onto your turntable. Now real quick, let's talk about turntables. Having a turntable is absolutely crucial if you want to get perfectly smooth sides. It's just going to make things so much easier. I have this turntable from Ateco, which has a cast iron base. I absolutely love it because it spins around really smoothly and the heavy base prevents it from sliding around on the counter. When I first started baking, I just used a cheap plastic turntable and that worked fine too. Some turntables have little rubber grips on top that prevent your cake from sliding around. If you don't have that, you can put down a little piece of tape to hold the cake board, or you can get some of this non-slip mat, which will also keep things from sliding around. Now we're almost ready to stack the cake, but there's one more thing that I want to tell you about before we actually start putting everything together, and that is the orientation of your cake layers as you stack them. So if you want to get the most perfectly straight-sided cake with a really nice smooth top, what you want to do is place your first cake layer so that the bottom where it was touching the cake pan goes onto the cake board. That's going to give you a really nice even base, right? Because the bottom of the cake pan was perfectly flat. The middle layers, you can flip around and do them whichever way you like. If your layers are just maybe a little bit uneven, try to see if you can match them up so that they balance each other out. And then for your last cake layer, you actually want to invert it and have the part that was touching the bottom of the cake pan pointing up. And that's gonna give you a really nice flat top. All right, so the first thing that I like to do is to take my offset spatula and put a small dab of frosting onto the cake board, and that'll keep the first layer from sliding around as we start to frost. Put your first cake layer down onto the board and try to get it as evenly centered as possible. Now it's time to start putting the frosting in between the layers, and you want to get this even as well, surprise, surprise. You can totally eyeball this, but if you're not comfortable eyeballing it, there are a few tricks that you can use to keep the fillings even. I like to use this cookie scoop so that I can count out however many I like to do. Usually around 4 or 5 of these 1 ounce scoops is what I use for a 6-inch cake. And that will ensure that the frosting in between each layer is exactly even. You don't want to overfill in between the layers of cake, because if you have a thick layer of frosting, it's going to be pretty unstable and your cake layers are going to end up sliding around. Use your spatula to gently press the buttercream back and forth until it's about even all the way around the layer, and then you can kind of hold it with a tip towards the outer edge of the cake and spin your turntable all the way around so that you get a nice, smooth, even layer. Go ahead and put on your next cake layer and then repeat with filling and cake layers until you get to the top layer, which remember you want to put down bottom side up. At this point, you can stop, take a step back, and look and make sure that all of your layers are even. If they're not, it's not a big deal. Just give them a little push until everything is even. All right, so now that we've got our cake layers stacked, it's time for the crumb coat. So the crumb coat is kind of like a primer for our final layer of frosting. It's going to seal in the crumbs so that when you go to do your last layer of frosting, everything can be nice and clean. This coat of frosting should be so thin that you can see the cake through it, but you also want to try to make it as even as possible. So what I like to do is just put a nice big blob of buttercream on top of my cake, and then use my offset spatula to slowly spread it across the top and then down the sides. It definitely doesn't need to be a perfect coat of frosting. What you just want to avoid is having big chunks of frosting that are sort of hanging out or gaps, because those are going to make it harder to get an even final coat of frosting. While you're putting on your crumb coat, if you need to scrape off your spatula, make sure you do it in a separate bowl and not back into your clean frosting. Otherwise, you're going to get crumbs into your frosting. Once you've got your cake crumb coated, the next thing you want to do is chill it in the refrigerator until that buttercream starts to set up a little bit. So you can do this for as little as 10 or 15 minutes, or you can leave it in there for 30 minutes or an hour. Whatever works for you is really fine. The only thing to watch out for is that if you leave your cake in the refrigerator for a long time and it gets really cold, when you go to put on your final coat of frosting, it's gonna start chilling down really fast and make it a little bit harder to spread. So you might not want to let it get too cold. Before you move your cake into the fridge, remember this is your last chance to make sure the layers are all even and not leaning to one side. So get down on eye level with your cake and spin it around, and if you need to nudge it one way or the other, do that now before you put on your final coat of frosting. All right, we're almost finished. Now it's time to do the final frosting coat. I will usually just do this the same way that I did the crumb coat, which is to just plop a bunch of frosting on top and slowly work it down the sides. However, if you want to make it a little bit easier for yourself to get a really nice even coat, one trick that you can do is to use a piping bag. You don't need to have a tip on your piping bag, but you do want to keep the hole at the end of your piping bag the same size as the thickness that you want the frosting on your cake. I hope that makes sense. So on this bag that I have here, the hole was a little bit big, so I just put this coupler in just to make it a little bit smaller. So load up your piping bag with frosting. You can always add more if you need it, and then just try to pipe really even lines all the way around the sides and up to the top of your cake. So again, this might seem a little bit extra, but if you're one of those people who feels like they have trouble just spreading the frosting around, this can really help you get that even base a lot faster. Once you have an even amount of frosting spread all around your cake, it's time to smooth it out. I would generally use my offset spatula to do the first smoothing and then go back in with my cake scraper to get those really nice, perfect smooth sides and crisp edges. When you hold your cake scraper, you don't want to just jab the flat edge right into your cake. What you actually want to do is hold it at more of an angle against your cake, and that's going to help you smooth it out. If you go straight in, what you're going to end up with is a lot of lines in your cake. All right, so to smooth out this last layer of frosting, you're going to take your cake scraper. You want to place it very gently up against your cake, remember at an angle, and it also helps to take the bottom edge of your scraper and make sure that that's flat on the turntable. That way you know you're not scraping at an angle. And what you want to do is hold the cake scraper in one place and move the cake with your other hand. So it's a little counterintuitive. You don't want to use your scraping hand to scrape icing off. You want this to stay in one place and use the turntable, because the turntable is going to be a lot more even and a lot more steady than if you use your hand. To get a really nice, even, perfectly smooth coat of frosting on the sides of your cake, it usually takes quite a few passes around with your cake scraper. So every time you spin the turntable around, make sure that you clean off your cake scraper. Any residue of buttercream that you have on here is just going to sort of build up and keep messing up your cake. If you have any holes or gaps in your frosting that are just glaring and you want to fix them, take your small offset spatula and fill those in with a little bit of extra buttercream, then keep smoothing with your cake scraper. Also, a note for my perfectionists out there. If getting perfectly smooth sides and sharp corners on your cakes is something that's driving you crazy, I have a secret for you. Most other people's cakes are not as perfect as you think they are. Either they're just photographed really well, or they just look better because it's not your cake. So if it's driving you crazy, just try to relax a little bit and don't worry about making everything perfect. It's still going to look great. Okay, and the final step for frosting your cake is to smooth out the top. There are a few different ways to do this, but what I like to do is use my offset spatula again. What you want to do is start at the very edge and gently pull in towards the center. This is another one of those things that can drive you crazy, so just try to get it mostly level, but don't worry about getting it perfect. Every time that you scrape your spatula from the edge to the center, make sure that you clean it off again and repeat the process the whole way around the cake until you have a nice smooth top. And now it's time to decorate your cake. If you need some ideas, why don't you go ahead and check out one of my other videos for some decorating inspiration. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.